When did your parents' rules backfire so hard it almost cost them their life? My father forbade me from speaking to any man outside our family because he said it would destroy my purity and make me worthless. It started when I turned 13 and suddenly went from his little girl to what he called a salt in training that needed to be controlled. He pulled me out of public school and put me in an all-girls academy where even the janitors and bus drivers had to be female. He monitored every phone call, deleted all my social media, and installed tracking apps to make sure I never went anywhere that might have male employees. When we went grocery shopping, he'd speak for me if the cashier was male, telling them I had a speech impediment rather than admit his real reason. The restrictions got more extreme every year until I basically lived in a bubble. If a delivery driver showed up and happened to be male, I had to hide upstairs. When our neighbor had a heart attack and knocked on our door begging for help, Dad made me stay silent in my room while he called the ambulance because I couldn't be let speak to a dying man. He said one word to one man would lead to another, and eventually I'd be ruined like all the other girls. Dad had already picked out my future husband through his church, a man 20 years older than me who agreed that women should be silent and obedient. The wedding was planned for my 18th birthday. I'd never even been allowed to speak to my future husband because Dad said that could wait until after the ceremony. He'd thrown away my college acceptance letters without telling me, saying education would make me argumentative and unsuitable for marriage. When I found the shredded remains in the trash and confronted him, he slapped me for the first time and said questioning him was practice for questioning God. By 17, I'd never had a conversation with a male teacher, never worked a part-time job, never even ordered my own food at restaurants if the server was male. Dad would proudly tell his friends that I was still pure, like I was some artifact in a museum instead of a human being. I became an expert at navigating the world in silence whenever men were present. At the pharmacy, I'd write my questions on paper and hand them to female employees. During parent-teacher conferences, I'd sit mute while Dad explained to bewildered male teachers why I couldn't respond to their questions. The yearbook committee wanted to interview me about winning the science fair, but when they sent Ryan from the journalism class, Dad slammed the door in his face and filed a complaint with the school about inappropriate contact attempts. Thursday night, Dad was eating dinner and lecturing me about staying vigilant against male manipulation. He was going on about how even male doctors were dangerous, because they'd use medical examinations as an excuse to corrupt young women, when suddenly he stopped mid-sentence and grabbed his throat. His face turned red, then purple as he stood up from the table, knocking his plate onto the floor. He was pointing at his neck and making these horrible gasping sounds, and I realized a piece of chicken was lodged in his windpipe. I tried the Heimlich maneuver like we'd learned in health class, but I wasn't strong enough to dislodge it. Dad fell to his knees, his lips turning blue, his eyes bulging as he desperately tried to breathe. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the numbers. The phone rang once, twice, and then a male voice answered with those professional words that meant help was coming, except I wasn't supposed to talk to him. 911, what's your emergency? I stood there holding the phone while my father collapsed onto the kitchen floor, his body convulsing as it ran out of oxygen. The male operator kept repeating his question, asking if anyone was there, saying he could hear sounds of distress and was already sending help if I could just give him an address. Dad's eyes found mine from the floor, and even through his panic I could see him shaking his head no, telling me not to break the rule even though his face was turning gray. Ma'am, if you can't speak, just tap the phone once for yes when I ask questions, the operator said, his voice calm and professional. But I needed to tell him about the choking, about the chicken, about exactly what was happening so they'd bring the right equipment and know what to expect. Dad was making these weak scratching sounds against the tile floor, his movements getting slower, and I had to choose between his life and his most sacred rule. Please, if someone is hurt, you need to talk to me so I can help, the operator said, and I could hear typing in the background as he tried to trace the call. Dad's hand reached toward me one more time before going still, his eyes rolling back, and I opened my mouth to speak, but 17 years of conditioning made my throat close up like I was the one choking. My dad was about to die because of his own rule, and for a moment I wondered if that would really be the worst thing. The words stuck in my throat for another second before I forced them out in a whisper so quiet I wasn't sure he heard. 1247 Maple Street. The operator typed fast and said help was 3 minutes away. Is the person conscious? I looked at Dad's still body and managed to say no. The operator told me to turn him on his back and start pushing on his chest. My hands shook as I rolled Dad over, his body heavy and limp. I put my hands on his chest like we learned in health class and started pushing down hard. Count out loud for me, the operator said. I counted 1, 2, 3, each number feeling wrong coming out of my mouth to a man. Dad's ribs made cracking sounds under my hands. The operator kept talking, telling me to push harder, faster, don't stop. My arms burned, but I kept going, counting to 30 over and over. You're doing great, keep going, help is almost there, he said. I heard sirens getting closer, and the operator told me to unlock the front door. My legs felt weak as I ran to the door, turned the deadbolt, then ran back to Dad. The thought of male paramedics coming in made me want to hide upstairs like always, but Dad's face was gray and his lips were blue. I kept pushing on his chest, my whole body shaking now. The door burst open and 2 people in uniforms rushed in with bags and equipment. One was a woman with brown hair pulled back, the other a man with a beard. I backed against the wall as they dropped beside Dad. The woman started working on him right away while the man asked me what happened. My throat closed up completely. I pointed at my neck and then at Dad, but no words came out. The woman looked up and saw my panic. "I'm Lara. This is my partner," she said, taking over the questions. "Was he eating?" I nodded and pointed at the chicken on the floor. "How long has he been down?" I held up 5 fingers, then 6. Not really sure anymore. Lara grabbed something from her bag and tilted Dad's head back. She put a metal tool in his mouth and used long tweezers to pull out a piece of chicken from his throat. The male paramedic, who Lara called Ruben, started doing CPR with a machine that pumped Dad's chest. They put a mask over his face and squeezed a bag to push air into his lungs. "We got a pulse back, but he's not breathing on his own," Ruben said. Lara looked at me and asked if I wanted to ride in the ambulance. I nodded because what else could I do? They lifted Dad onto a stretcher with tubes and wires everywhere. As we went outside, I saw neighbors standing on their lawns watching. The man from 3 houses down, the one who had the heart attack Dad wouldn't let me help, was there too. He looked at me with this expression I couldn't read. In the ambulance, Ruben sat in back with us and started asking about Dad's medical history and medications. I froze again, my hands gripping the bench. Lara noticed from where she was working on Dad and took over. "Does he take any medicines?" she asked gently. I nodded and held up 3 fingers. "High blood pressure?" I nodded. "Diabetes?" I shook my head. "Heart problems?" I nodded again. She seemed to understand something was wrong beyond just the emergency. She kept her voice soft and gave me space, not pushing when I couldn't answer. The hospital was loud and bright and full of people. They rushed Dad through double doors while a nurse in pink scrubs led me to a waiting area. There were men everywhere. Male doctors in white coats walked past. A male security guard stood by the entrance. Men sat with their families in the plastic chairs. Their voices filled the room and I felt like I was drowning. I found a chair in the corner and pulled my knees up to my chest. About 20 minutes later, a woman in nice clothes walked over to me. She had dark hair and kind eyes. "I'm Kalani Santos. I'm a social worker here at the hospital," she said, sitting down but leaving space between us. "Do you have anyone we can call? Family or friends?" I shook my head because Dad had cut us off from everyone years ago. "Mom's family was too worldly," he said. His own brother asked too many questions. The church people only knew what Dad told them. We were alone by his choice, and now I was alone because of it. Kalani pulled a small notepad from her pocket and handed it to me with a pen. "The doctors need to know about your dad's medications and health history," she said quietly. I wrote down the 3 medicines Dad took every morning for his heart and blood pressure. My hand shook as I added that he had diabetes too, but refused to take insulin because he said God would heal him. She nodded and took the notepad to show the nurses who were waiting by the desk. They rushed off with the information while Kalani came back and sat down again. She didn't ask me anything else right away, which was good because my hands were still shaking. We sat there for what felt like forever, watching people come and go through the emergency room doors. A man in a white coat finally walked over to us after about 3 hours. Kalani stood up and moved closer to me like she knew I'd need her there. The doctor started explaining that Dad had been without oxygen for too long before the paramedics got his heart beating again. He used words like hypoxic brain injury and said they'd moved Dad to the ICU, but he wasn't breathing on his own yet. The machines were keeping him alive while they waited to see how much damage had been done to his brain. I felt something weird in my chest, like relief mixed with guilt, because maybe Dad would never wake up to control me again. Kalani thanked the doctor and he walked away to deal with other patients. She sat back down and asked me gentle questions about home, like did I have other family or somewhere safe to stay. I shook my head because Dad had cut everyone off years ago when they questioned his rules. "Do you feel safe going home alone tonight?" she asked, and something about the way she said it made me start crying. I didn't know how to exist without Dad telling me what to do every second of every day. She rubbed my back while I cried and said she'd arrange for me to stay in one of the hospital's family rooms overnight. "We can talk more tomorrow about what happens next," she said, and helped me stand up. She walked me to a small room with a bed and bathroom down the hall from the ICU. Before she left, she turned and said it was really brave of me to call 911 and speak to save my dad's life. The door closed and I was alone with my thoughts for the first time in years without Dad monitoring me. I couldn't sleep that night thinking about how his own rule almost killed him. 17 years of training had almost let him die on our kitchen floor. Around 2 in the morning, the male doctor knocked and came in to check on me. He asked if I needed anything, and the words stuck in my throat for a moment. Then I managed to whisper, "Thank you," and it felt like the biggest thing I'd ever done. He smiled and said to call if I needed help, then left me alone again. The next morning, Kalani came back, but she wasn't alone this time. A woman in a dark suit followed her into the room carrying a folder and badge. "This is Detective Adelina Velez," Kalani said as they both sat down. Adelina explained she worked with cases involving controlling family situations and needed to ask me some questions. She was patient when I had to write some answers instead of speaking them out loud. She asked about the rules and restrictions and how long they'd been going on. I told her about the all-girls school and hiding from delivery drivers and not being allowed to speak to men. Her face got more serious with each thing I shared, and she kept making notes in her folder. She showed me pamphlets about different kinds of abuse and pointed out that what I'd lived through wasn't normal or okay. Adelina explained that since Dad couldn't make decisions right now because of his condition, the state had to figure out guardianship. I was 17, which made things complicated because I wasn't quite an adult yet. She mentioned that Dad had paperwork naming a church elder as backup guardian, but that man was investigated for his own problems. Right then we heard shouting in the hallway, and a man burst through the door before security could stop him. It was Elder Matthews from Dad's church, and his face was red with anger. "This girl needs to come with me immediately," he said, grabbing for my arm. Adelina stood up fast and got between us while calling for security on her radio. Elder Matthews kept yelling that Dad would want me to maintain my purity until the wedding could happen. He said I was promised to Brother Joseph and the ceremony would proceed as planned on my 18th birthday. 2 security guards rushed in and grabbed his arms when he tried to push past Adelina to get to me. They dragged him out while he screamed about sin and corruption and how I was poisoned by worldly influences. Adelina made notes about filing for an emergency restraining order to keep him away from me. Kalani had her hand on my shoulder the whole time, and I realized I was shaking again. After things calmed down, Kalani said she knew someone who could help me with somewhere safe to stay. She called a woman named Sydney McGee, who ran a shelter for women leaving controlling situations like mine. Sydney arrived within an hour and sat down to explain how the shelter worked. They had counselors who understood religious trauma and conditioning and could help me learn to function in the normal world. She said I could stay there while the legal stuff got sorted out, and they'd help me figure out next steps. Adelina said she needed to go with me to the house to get clothes and important documents. We drove there in her unmarked police car, and the house felt different without Dad in it. She helped me pack a bag while looking through Dad's office for paperwork about me. That's when we found the filing cabinet with all his plans for my future. There were contracts with Brother Joseph about the marriage, including a bride price Dad had already accepted. We found letters from colleges accepting me with scholarship offers that Dad had declined without telling me. One school had offered me $50,000 for my science fair work and perfect grades. Adelina took pictures of everything for evidence and packed the important documents in a box. She said this would help prove Dad had been controlling and abusing me even if he didn't see it that way. We left the house and I didn't look back because I knew I might never live there again. Sydney's shelter was an old house painted yellow with a big porch and normal-looking yard that made it seem like any other home on the street. She met us at the door and showed me to a small room with a single bed and a dresser where I could put my things, while Adelina carried in the box of documents from Dad's office. Sydney walked me through the common areas and introduced me to 3 women sitting at the kitchen table, who all looked up when we entered. Maria was maybe 40 with tired eyes and told me she'd been there 2 months after leaving her husband, who wouldn't let her work or have her own bank account. Janet was older and had burn scars on her arms from when her boyfriend threw hot oil at her for talking to the mailman. The youngest was Beth, who was 23, and had run from a religious group that wanted to marry her to their leader, who already had 6 wives. They all nodded when Sydney explained my situation, and Beth reached over to squeeze my hand because she understood the church stuff better than the others. Sydney showed me the schedule for meals and chores and group sessions where we could talk about our experiences if we wanted to. The shelter had cameras everywhere and panic buttons in each room, and a security system that would alert the police if anyone tried to break in. That first night, I barely slept because every sound made me think Dad had somehow gotten out of the hospital to drag me home. The next morning, the hospital called Sydney's office phone since I didn't have my own number yet, and she brought me into her office to take the call on speaker. The doctor explained that Dad was stable but still unconscious, and they needed someone to make decisions about putting in a feeding tube and other medical stuff. Since I was only 17 and Dad hadn't legally named anyone else to make choices for him, the state would have to appoint a guardian for his medical care. The doctor said this process could take a few days, and meanwhile they would keep him stable with basic care. I asked if he might wake up, and the doctor said brain scans showed activity, but they couldn't predict when or if he'd regain consciousness. After the call, Sydney helped me understand that this meant I wouldn't have to make those hard choices about Dad's care, which a relief. 3 days later, my school counselor showed up at the shelter with a cardboard box full of my homework and textbooks. Mrs. Yoon had heard about everything from the police who'd contacted the school as part of their investigation. She spread out college brochures on Sydney's desk and explained that several schools had special programs for students who'd experienced trauma or left controlling families. The applications were due in 3 weeks for spring semester, but she said she'd help me with the essays and getting my transcripts sent. She'd brought the acceptance letters from last year that she'd kept copies of in her files, including the one with the $50,000 scholarship for science. Mrs. Yoon said that money was probably still available if we contacted them to explain what happened with Dad hiding the letters. Detective Velez came by that afternoon with updates about the church investigation that my case had triggered. She sat with Sydney and me in the office and pulled out her notebook full of notes from interviews she'd been conducting. 3 other families at Dad's church had similar situations with daughters being controlled and marriages being arranged to older men in the congregation. One girl was only 15, and her wedding was planned for next month to a man who was 38. Another family had pulled their daughter out of school completely, and she hadn't been seen in public for 6 months. The detective said my 911 call and Dad's condition gave them probable cause to investigate the whole church, and they'd found financial records showing money changing hands for these marriages. The church elders were calling them dowries, but the detective said it looked more like human trafficking. She needed me to write down everything I remembered about the plans Dad made with the church about my marriage. 2 days after that, Sydney introduced me to a therapist named Dr. Kim, who specialized in helping people who'd been controlled by religious groups. We met in a small room at the shelter that had soft chairs and a white noise machine by the door for privacy. Dr. Kim explained we'd start really slow with exposure therapy to help me get comfortable talking to men again. The shelter had a male janitor named Carl, who came 3 times a week, and she wanted me to practice just being in the same room as him at first. The next week, Carl was mopping the hallway and Dr. Kim stood with me at the end of the corridor while my whole body shook just from seeing him there. She had me take deep breaths and reminded me that Carl was just doing his job and had no interest in talking to me. After a few minutes, I could walk past him to get to my room, though my heart was pounding the whole time. The session after that, she had Carl say good morning to me when I walked by, and I was supposed to nod back. It took 3 tries before I could make myself look at him and nod, and afterwards I threw up in the bathroom from anxiety. Dr. Kim said this was normal, and my body was reacting to 17 years of conditioning that would take time to overcome. 2 weeks after Dad went into the hospital, Sydney got a call that he was showing signs of waking up. The doctor said he was moving his eyes to track people and squeezing his hand when asked, but he couldn't talk or move much else. They moved him from intensive care to a regular room and started planning for long-term rehabilitation. The social worker at the hospital called to say Dad would never be able to live alone again and would need either a nursing home or full-time care. The state had appointed a guardian to make these decisions since Dad had no family besides me and I was still a minor. Sydney warned me that Dad might try to contact me once he could communicate better, and we should be prepared. Sure enough, 3 days later, Sydney got a call from someone at Dad's church saying Elder Matthews wanted to talk to me about the wedding plans. The man on the phone said it was my duty to honor the agreement Dad had made since that's what God wanted for my life. Sydney told him I wasn't available and hung up. But then we got calls from 3 other church members over the next 2 days, all saying the same thing. Letters started arriving at the shelter addressed to me talking about my obligations and how I was bringing shame on my family by hiding from my responsibilities. Sydney helped me file paperwork for an emergency protective order to stop the harassment. The court date was set for the following week, and I'd have to testify about why I needed protection from the church elder. The thought of talking in court made me sick, but Sydney said she'd be there with me, and we could ask for accommodations. The morning of the hearing, I put on the most conservative outfit I had, and Sydney drove me to the courthouse. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and flags in the corner. Elder Matthews was there with a lawyer, and he kept staring at me like I was some kind of traitor. The judge was an older man with gray hair and glasses who looked tired already at 9 in the morning. When it was my turn to testify, I had to walk up to a chair next to the judge and promise to tell the truth. My voice came out as barely a whisper when I said yes, and the judge asked me to speak louder. I started explaining about Dad's rules and how I'd never been allowed to talk to men, and my voice shook so bad I had to stop and start over twice. The judge was patient and told me to take my time. I told him about the arranged marriage and how I was supposed to marry someone I'd never even met on my 18th birthday. I explained about the church elder trying to contact me through other people, and the letters saying I had to honor Dad's agreement even though Dad couldn't even talk anymore. Elder Matthews' lawyer tried to argue that this was a religious matter, and the court shouldn't interfere, but the judge cut him off. The judge asked me directly if I wanted to marry the man Dad had chosen, and I managed to say no loud enough for the court reporter to hear. He granted the protective order for 1 year, and said Elder Matthews couldn't contact me directly, or through third parties, or come within 500 feet of me. The judge added that what he'd heard was deeply troubling, and he'd be forwarding his concerns to the district attorney's office. As we left the courthouse, Adelina was waiting in the hallway, and pulled Sydney and me aside. She had news about the man Dad had arranged for me to marry. Brother Joseph had been arrested 2 states over on charges involving another minor from a different church. The police found evidence he'd been doing this for years, moving between religious communities and targeting families with young daughters. When Adelina showed me his mugshot, I ran to the bathroom and threw up everything in my stomach. This was who Dad was going to give me to in 3 months when I turned 18. Sydney drove me back to the shelter after the courthouse, and said there was a support group meeting that afternoon for girls from controlling families. The meeting room had 8 chairs in a circle, and 5 other girls already sitting when I walked in, all of them between 14 and 19, and I could see the same scared look in their eyes that I saw in my mirror every morning. The group leader was a woman named Maria, who'd escaped her own controlling father 20 years ago, and now helped other girls learn how to function in the normal world. She had us start with something simple, going around the circle and saying our names, and one thing we wanted to learn, and when it was my turn, I whispered that I wanted to learn how to order food from male servers without panicking. The girl next to me nodded and said she had the same problem, and Maria said we'd practice that today by walking to the diner down the street together. My hands started shaking at the thought, but the other girls said they'd be right there with me, and we walked as a group to the small restaurant where Maria had already called ahead to explain our situation. The server was a young guy, maybe 20 years old, who smiled and asked what we wanted to drink, and I froze completely while the other girls ordered water and soda. Maria touched my arm gently and reminded me to breathe, then asked if I could point to what I wanted on the menu, and I managed to tap the lemonade option with my finger. The server said no problem and wrote it down without making me feel weird about not talking, and by the time our food came, I managed to whisper, "Thank you," when he set down my sandwich. Back at the shelter, my phone rang, and it was Kalani calling from the hospital to tell me Dad was getting better and starting to understand what was happening around him. She said he'd been asking where I was and got really upset when the nurses said I wasn't there, trying to pull out his breathing tube and demanding to see me until they had to give him medicine to calm him down. 3 weeks had passed since that night with the chicken, and my school counselor came to the shelter with a stack of college applications and brochures. She spread them out on the table, and we looked at schools that were at least 200 miles away so the church people couldn't easily find me, but not so far that I'd feel completely lost. We focused on places with good support systems, and she helped me write essays about overcoming challenges without mentioning the specific details that might identify Dad or the church. Sydney sat with me the next day to fill out financial aid forms and explained that Dad had hidden scholarship money from me that we might be able to get back. She made phone calls to 3 organizations and found out that one of them, a science scholarship worth $8,000, had kept the money in a special account when they couldn't confirm I'd actually turned it down. The paperwork took forever, but Sydney knew exactly what to write and helped me understand terms like disbursement and enrollment verification that I'd never heard before. My therapist started working with me on phone calls because I needed to be able to talk to men for college and jobs and just basic life stuff. We started really small with me calling the pizza place down the street to ask what time they closed, and even though the call lasted maybe 10 seconds, my voice shook the whole time and I had to sit down after because my legs felt weak. Each day we did another call. The library hours, the pharmacy, the hardware store, and slowly my voice got steadier, even though my heart still raced every time a man answered. Detective Velez came to the shelter with updates about the church investigation and told me they'd found evidence of major financial crimes and tax fraud going back years. The elder who'd tried to get custody of me was now facing federal charges that would probably mean prison time. And she said the FBI was involved because some of the money had crossed state lines. 4 weeks after Dad's emergency, Kalani called to say he was awake enough to have visitors if I wanted to see him, and I decided to go with her for support. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant, and Dad looked smaller somehow in the bed with all the machines around him, his face thin and his hair messy in a way he never would have allowed before. When he saw me, his eyes got wide and he tried to talk, but the words came out slurred and hard to understand, something about purity and corruption and how I needed to come home right away. I stood at the foot of his bed and told him clearly that I'd talk to men to save his life, that I'd keep talking to whoever I needed to talk to, and that I wasn't coming home. He started thrashing in the bed and making these angry sounds, trying to sit up even though he could barely move, and the machine started beeping as his heart rate shot up. The nurses rushed in, and one of them asked us to leave while they gave him medication, and the doctor told us later that visits should be limited because Dad's agitation was bad for his recovery. Part of me felt guilty, but my therapist reminded me in our next session that Dad's reactions were his choice and his responsibility, not mine, and I didn't have to manage his emotions anymore. A month after everything started, I got my first job at a bookstore owned by a woman named Jenny, who knew my situation from Sydney and wanted to help. The store was small and cozy with books stacked everywhere, and even though most of the employees were women, male customers came in all the time looking for recommendations or asking about orders. Jenny started me on inventory in the back room, but gradually had me help at the register, standing next to me the first few times I had to ring up a male customer. My hands shook so bad I could barely work the cash register when a man asked me where the history section was, but I managed to point him in the right direction, and Jenny squeezed my shoulder and said I did great. 2 months after Dad's crisis, I got acceptance letters from 2 colleges for spring semester, both with financial aid packages that would cover most of my costs. One school had a special program for students escaping controlling families with extra counseling and advisors who understood trauma. Plus, they'd let me have a single room instead of a roommate if I needed it for feeling safe. The church rumors started spreading fast through our old neighborhood, with people calling me possessed and corrupted. But something unexpected happened when 3 different mothers contacted Sydney asking for help getting their own daughters out. I sat in Sydney's office while she took these calls, watching her write down addresses and ages, realizing my situation was helping other girls escape the same trap. Sydney drove me to the DMV the next week since Dad never let me learn to drive, saying I didn't need to go anywhere without him controlling the destination. The male driving instructor was patient when I explained why I couldn't look him in the eye at first, and he kept his voice calm while teaching me to parallel park. My hands shook on the steering wheel every time he gave directions, but after 4 lessons I managed to pass the test and get my license. The hospital called to say they were moving Dad to a specialized brain injury facility 40 miles away since he needed long-term rehabilitation. The state appointed a neutral guardian to make his medical decisions because I was still 17, and he had no other appropriate family members. I started volunteering at the shelter 3 nights a week, sitting with new arrivals who couldn't stop crying or who jumped every time a door slammed. Teaching them the breathing exercises my therapist taught me helped reinforce my own progress, and showing them how to write out their thoughts when speaking was too hard made me realize how far I'd come. The therapist arranged practice job interviews with male volunteers from a local community center, setting up mock scenarios where I had to answer questions about my skills and experience. My voice still caught sometimes when they asked about my work history, but I pushed through the fear and managed to complete 3 full practice interviews. Detective Velez visited the shelter with news that made everyone stop what they were doing to listen. The investigation had revealed such extensive abuse patterns that the state was shutting down Dad's church completely, and the man Dad chose as my future husband had fled to another state, but was now on a federal watch list. 6 weeks after Dad choked on that piece of chicken, I packed my few belongings and moved from the shelter to a transitional housing program for young adults escaping bad situations. The apartment was tiny with peeling paint and noisy pipes, but it had locks I controlled and no tracking apps monitoring my every movement. The college sent my roommate assignment in a thick envelope full of orientation materials, and her name was Sarah, another girl escaping a controlling family who understood why I cried when I saw the class schedule with male professors' names. We texted constantly before move-in day, sharing our fears about living away from our family's control and building a friendship based on understanding what the other had survived. I went to the courthouse and legally changed my phone number and email address, filling out paperwork that would cut off the last ways Dad's church friends could reach me with their messages about returning to righteousness. The freedom of choosing who could contact me felt like taking off chains I'd worn so long I'd forgotten they were there. At the bookstore, a man came in looking for a birthday present for his 12-year-old daughter who loved fantasy novels. Jenny stood nearby while I showed him our young adult section, and my voice stayed steady as I recommended 3 different series about brave girls finding their own paths. He thanked me and bought all 3 books I suggested, and Jenny squeezed my shoulder after he left, proud that I'd managed a completely normal customer interaction. Each day got a little easier. Each conversation with a male stranger felt less like drowning, and I started to believe I might actually make it through college and build the life Dad tried to steal from me. The hospital called 3 days later with an update that changed everything. Dad could talk again, but the words came out slow and mixed up, and the doctor explained he'd never walk without help or live alone again. The left side of his body barely worked, and he needed someone to help him eat and get dressed and do everything he used to control in my life. When I visited him that week, he tried to lecture me about staying pure, but kept forgetting words and getting confused about where he was. The nurse had to remind him 3 times that I was his daughter, not his sister, and he kept asking why the male orderly was allowed in his room. 2 months after he choked on that chicken, I boarded a plane by myself for the first time to visit the college campus. The male TSA agent asked me to remove my shoes, and I did it without freezing up. Then the taxi driver from the airport talked about his daughter going to the same school. Walking around campus felt like stepping into a different world, where nobody knew about Dad's rules or the wedding he'd planned for my birthday. The dorm rooms were small, but they had locks I'd control, and the library stayed open all night for students who wanted to study. A week later, an envelope arrived at the shelter from the scholarship organization that had kept my money when Dad never responded to their letters. They wanted me to speak at their annual dinner about educational barriers and how they could identify other girls whose parents might be hiding opportunities. I wrote back saying yes, because maybe my story could help them save someone else before it was too late. My 18th birthday came on a Tuesday at the transitional housing. No white dress or church ceremony, or man 20 years older waiting at an altar. Sydney brought a chocolate cake from the grocery store, and the other residents sang happy birthday in the common room. All of us survivors of different kinds of control. We stayed up late talking about our plans, mine for college and theirs for jobs or trade schools, or just learning to exist without someone watching every move. The therapist scheduled my last session before college for that Friday, saying we'd covered 2 years of work and 2 months of intensive meetings. She taught me how to spot controlling behavior in new people, and gave me worksheets about maintaining boundaries and recognizing red flags in relationships. I practiced saying no to different scenarios she acted out, my voice getting stronger each time I refused something that didn't feel right. Packing for college felt like planning an escape all over again, except this time it was legal and celebrated. I bought jeans that actually fit instead of the long skirts Dad demanded, and tank tops that showed my shoulders and a laptop without any tracking software. Each piece of clothing I folded into the suitcase was something Dad would have burned if he'd found it in my closet 6 months ago. The bookstore let me pick out novels he'd called gateway drugs to sin, stories about women who made their own choices and didn't apologize for existing. Freshman orientation started with all the new students split into discussion groups, and mine had 4 girls and 5 guys talking about what we wanted to study. When my turn came, I told them about wanting to major in psychology, to understand how people get trapped in controlling situations and how to help them escape. One guy asked about my interest in that specific area, and I gave him a real answer, not silence or looking at the floor. The girl next to me mentioned her dad was super strict too, and we exchanged numbers to get coffee later. By December, I was writing my name on final exams in classes Dad never wanted me to take. My roommate and I had decorated our dorm room with posters of female scientists and writers, and I worked 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore, where half my coworkers were guys. The engineering student from my calculus study group asked me to see a movie, and I said yes, then actually showed up and sat next to him and shared popcorn like a normal person. He walked me back to my dorm and asked if we could study together again. And when I agreed, he smiled and said he'd text me tomorrow. My grades came back all A's, and I called Sydney to tell her, crying happy tears because 6 months ago I couldn't even speak to save Dad's life, and now I was building something completely my own. Well, that's gonna do it for now. Thanks for just being here and exploring all these curious details with me. Always enjoy sharing this time with you. Subscribe for more content like this.